on the original season of Killing Pain.
Make no mistake about it, it's affecting our entire country. It can happen to anybody.
We told the story of Oklahoma's opioid addiction epidemic.
This is the epidemic of my generation. This is my HIV, this is my Black Plague.
Since 1999, more than 300,000 Americans have died from an opioid-related overdose.
Our country loses more people to overdoses, prescription drug overdoses, than we lost in the entire Vietnam War. I mean, that's a staggering number.
Oklahomans are dying from this preventable and treatable disease on a daily basis.
And we were at the top of the list for the number of people who were being prescribed and the number of prescriptions we had available and pills in our community.
As the prescribing went up, rates of addiction and overdose deaths went up right along with the increase in prescribing.
In fact, if you looked at the map of how the opioids are advancing across the country, you would see the state of Oklahoma rise out of that because of every county in our state is seeing a rise in opioid deaths per 100,000.
The battle that every county in Oklahoma must fight took a different stand in Cleveland County. In the summer of 2019, the Attorney General of Oklahoma brought opioid manufacturers to court.
And it's time that they be held responsible for what they've done to the public in the state of Oklahoma.
Oklahoma's Attorney General says Johnson & Johnson caused the worst man-made crisis in the country.
What could be a precedent-setting trial
seeks to hold a giant drug maker to account.
Accused of corporate greed.
Now we may see if that argument holds up in court.
They've made hundreds of millions of dollars. They've made billions of dollars.
Money can make people and businesses do bad things.
Now the story of the landmark trial against the country's largest opioid producers and how the outcome will impact Oklahoma on this special edition of Killing Pain.
Thank you all for being here today.
He had been on the job for 4 months. But Attorney General Mike Hunter had plans to use his office to impact the largest crisis in the state of Oklahoma.
Earlier this morning, my office filed a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma, Allergan, Cephalon, and Janssen Pharmaceuticals. We believe these companies are culpable for the tragic, heartbreaking number of Oklahomans who have become addicted or who have died as a result of the opioid epidemic in our state.
This trial was the first time that a drug company was taken to task over its role in the opioid crisis in the United States at all. That has never happened before.
This lawsuit is about money that the taxpayers have been out because of the treatment, but it's also about much more. The practices that these pharmaceutical companies have engaged in has to be stopped.
These companies excelled at their core function, producing highly effective products. One product specifically was painkillers. These products changed the market and ultimately changed many of their consumers as well. Biologically, this is what happens. When a person takes an opioid, it begins to change the brain. This change is what we know as addiction, hijacking the reward center of the brain.
And the reward center is the reason why when I eat a cheeseburger, I get a sensation of happiness. And that's why I eat another cheeseburger later on. It's because my brain has remembered, oh, that was a positive experience. You should do that again. It does that on purpose because the brain wants me to eat. The reward for that is small. When you take an opioid, it does the same thing, but it does it much, much stronger. And it lays down new pathways. So it tells me that Mother Teresa taking these medications would get addicted.
Doctors were sold a bill of goods saying that these were not addictive. We didn't realize how addicting these were because the pharmaceutical companies told their reps to instruct physicians these weren't addictive. They could give them and they didn't have to worry about patients becoming addicted to it. So they were given for every minor pain.
By the spring of 2019, the public was well aware of the marketing practices of Purdue Pharmaceuticals, and Oklahoma's lawsuit was just one of thousands against the company. The drug giant was a leader in the opioid market worth billions.
I think that we were taken by surprise when Purdue announced a settlement for $270 million with the state, because Purdue was really the focus. Purdue produces OxyContin, which is a major driver of the opioid crisis in the United States in general. Attorney General Hunter stood in front of a big banner with Oklahoma State University logos all over the back, saying that the vast majority of that money would go towards a treatment and addiction center at Oklahoma State University in Tulsa.
This begins a new chapter for those struggling with addiction. It is going to save countless lives, and it's going to keep families together. I think the opportunity we have to be the MD Anderson Center for Addiction and Treatment is real and manifestly apparent to me.
I think we've been recognized in Oklahoma for the problem that we have, and we're now going to be recognized for being the solution.
This is just one piece. We still have 3 defendants. May 28th, we're on to our trial, and wish us luck. Thank you again very much. Thanks.
We'll see what happens, but I think everybody's going to be shocked that while all the press has been about Purdue, there's a big, bad company that's been behind this stuff equally with Purdue, if not a lot worse.
Teva Pharmaceuticals, the largest generic manufacturer of opioids, and its subsidiary, Cephalon, settled just days before the trial for $85 million, leaving one last defendant.
And then the end of May came, and Johnson & Johnson was the sole defendant in this case.
It was such a major story because it was the first, but it was also major because it was really going up against Big Pharma. And so eyes from all over the world were looking at the Cleveland County Courthouse just because they wanted to learn, they wanted to find out what we knew.
Oklahoma's Attorney General blames a pharmaceutical firm for the deaths of thousands of people. Starting today, that company, Johnson & Johnson, has its time in court. Jackie Fortier is on the line. She's a reporter for State Impact Oklahoma and has been covering this case for NPR. What does Oklahoma want?
Well, I mean, really, they're looking for funding. They're looking for as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. Taking these companies to court is really the only way the state can fund opioid treatment. This trial was about who caused the opioid crisis. Nothing short of that.
The very opening statements saw media from around the nation, around the world. Outside on the sidewalk, you saw cameras and lights and SAT trucks, and people were going live with updates at noon, and of course, the evening broadcasts.
This is CJ 2017-816, the state of Oklahoma, ex-rel Attorney General Mike Hunter versus Johnson & Johnson.
Other trials were kind of waiting for this one to develop to see how they proceeded. So the audience was there from the beginning of the opening statements of what's this going to look like? What is each side bringing to the table here?
I credentialed more than 250 members of the media. You had reporters from London and all over America, CNN, Fox, other networks, MSNBC. Even the opening statement was carried live on 3 networks.
They ignored centuries of experience, well-documented scientific histories of deadly addiction epidemics, and embarked on a cynical, deceitful, multi-million-dollar brainwashing campaign to establish opioid analgesics as the magic drug. How did this happen? At the end of the day, Your Honor, I have a short, one-word answer: greed.
I've never seen such world-class lawyering on both sides of a case like it was in this case in Cleveland County, Oklahoma.
The reason we have an opioid crisis is that simple. If you oversupply, people will die.
It literally is a case of heavyweights. They had everything on except the gloves.
It's a man-made crisis, but it is a drug company crisis, and it begins and it should end with them.
They caused this epidemic. Now they need to pay for it, Judge.
The day of reckoning is now here for Johnson & Johnson, Your Honor.
They bring a case before you, a state judge sitting behind the state seal, asking you to award the state money. So we certainly hope it's a level playing field. Why would a company like the people I represent come to a state being sued by the state's attorney general, asking for the state to give itself money? Why are we here? Because when you're right, you fight. Thank you.
How are y'all?
This trial was really about who fueled the opioid crisis and the marketing of those drugs, which is an incredibly high burden to try to prove.
Johnson & Johnson Janssen is in this up to their neck. They provided product for the rest of the industry. They collaborated with the industry, sold, marketed, and misrepresented opioid analgesic. So we feel good about our case.
The state argued that Johnson & Johnson aggressively and deceptively marketed their opioids to the general public, to doctors, that pain is an undertreated condition and that physicians should take it seriously. They were also being told that these drugs were not addictive.
The only way Johnson & Johnson can sell opioids is for a doctor to prescribe them. And until the mid-90s, doctors were not prescribing opioids. Then something happened.
They can't sell this drug without going through the doctors. They can't do it. And they spent all this money convincing doctors that their new time-release opioid was not dangerous. It was not addictive. That is demonstrably a lie.
The state argued that Johnson & Johnson created a multifaceted marketing strategy aimed at making doctors more comfortable in prescribing opioids. J&J used unbranded marketing, funded continuing medical education seminars. Key opinion leaders or experts in the field were commissioned to reinforce these ideas and sway perceptions. Reports and articles were then created as marketing materials, and J&J sales representatives would then use these materials to make in-person sales pitches to doctors. Throughout the crisis, Johnson & Johnson sales representatives made over 135,000 sales calls to Oklahoma doctors. The state argued their plan worked.
So as time goes on, they start making money, they start making a lot of money, and the marketing's working. And at the end of the day, the consequences of the mistake are hundreds of thousands of deaths and an addiction epidemic around the country.
We know that Johnson & Johnson didn't simply fund an unbranded campaign, but they also directly promoted their own opioids in ways that were improper. We know that their sales reps downplayed the addiction potential, promoted their products aggressively at a time when it was very clear that the United States was suffering from an epidemic of opioid addiction because of overprescribing.
It felt very calculated. It felt... This happened over a period of years. It's not like we didn't know what was happening.
The marketing plan was wildly successful, and it was very impressive. It's impressive from a professional standpoint, reviewing somebody else's work. I look at this work and I think, I wonder if they thought of, yep, they thought of that. Well, I wonder if they thought, yep, they thought of that too.
Do you have an opinion for the court? Is there a point in time where those opinions you just gave would change?
The only, the way it would change is if the product you're marketing kills people.
That's all I have, Your Honor. Pass witness.
It was shocking to sit in court and listen to the testimony and listen to them try to justify and simplify a lot of the things they were doing that were very complex and very manipulative. And so to have them be held accountable was something that was really powerful to witness in the courtroom.
So Johnson & Johnson's big argument was that they were playing by the rules and that clearly the regulators were the ones who had failed, that they hadn't done anything incorrect in their marketing, and that any failure was really on the part of the regulators.
Thank y'all for hanging around. You've heard a lot of very detailed testimony over the last several days, principally from the defendant's corporate representative. I've taken some notes, and I thought it was important to give you all some context. Sales reps were paid based on the number of prescriptions written, and they did that with the aid of a blizzard of leave-behinds, lunches, donuts, and don't worry about addiction winks and nods.
The defense claimed that when Johnson & Johnson and Janssen's sales representatives were calling on doctors, they were simply educating physicians about their two opioids, Duragesic and Nucynta.
And Janssen's Duragesic and Nucynta prescriptions make up less than 1% of those prescriptions approved for and paid for by the state.
The defense also claimed that the market share in Oklahoma for both of these prescription opioids were only 1% of the overall opioid market, a market led by drugs like oxycodone and hydrocodone. But the state of Oklahoma claimed J&J actually held a much greater stake in the market than just these two branded products.
Are we in this lawsuit just talking about Johnson & Johnson products, or are we talking about active API, active pharmaceutical ingredients for the whole industry?
Really, the API, I think, sums it all up, is that there's this chemical, opium, that has different base chemicals that are made into different opioid products. And it's that API that is the problem.
The process of manufacturing opioids starts with opium. Around half of the world's legal opioid crop comes from Tasmania. The largest supplier is a company called Tasmanian Alkaloids, which is owned by a U.S. company called Noramco. Noramco processes raw narcotic material, which they sell to the world's leading opioid manufacturers to be used in the creation of their drugs. Noramco was the nation's #1 supplier of the active pharmaceutical ingredient for the production of opioids. And for the heart of the opioid crisis, Noramco was owned by Johnson & Johnson.
These two entities, Noramco and Tasmanian Alkaloids, supplied over half of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in hydrocodone and oxycodone for most of the industry.
So Johnson & Johnson basically bought the supply line. So the state was arguing that because Johnson & Johnson owned so much, they didn't own all of it, but they did own a lot, they called Johnson & Johnson a kingpin of the opioid crisis.
The defense blamed everyone except themselves, for causing this crisis. The kingpin and largest supplier of opioids in America accepts zero responsibility.
Don't buy this argument about market share. This case isn't just about Duragesic and the drugs that Johnson & Johnson marketed under its own branding.
They unleashed a series of bombs on the United States of America, and those bombs hit squarely in the middle of our country in Oklahoma. And they're inferring that because we can only show they killed some of those Oklahomans, even though they provided the ingredients that killed many more, they should get to walk away scot-free. That's not right, that's not just, and that's insulting.
They marketed opioids as a class of drugs, and we all know why. Because they were the #1 supplier in the history of the United States of opioids. They stood everything to gain if opioids were accepted for this broad type of application.
Again, all legal, all done with the blessing of the U.S. federal government.
So let's look at the ingredients, because when they say oversupply, this is what they're trying to get you to focus on. Raw materials to process and turn into a drug approved by the FDA, regulated by all of these different groups at every step of the supply chain. This is not a free market. The supply is regulated by the government.
And then there were the witnesses who had first-hand knowledge of opioid addiction.
Austin was the youngest of our 3 children.
Witnesses like Craig Box, father of the beloved OU football player Austin Box, who died due to an opioid overdose.
He was a joy. He was a special young man.
Or Tanya Radcliffe, who fosters and cares for babies who suffer from neonatal abstinence syndrome, a syndrome suffered when mothers use opioids during pregnancy.
Do you feel like it would help you assist the court in this conversation if we were to show that picture and the court can see what you're describing?
Yes.
Can you put that into words? Is that what it's like?
That's what it's like.
Beyond the facts of the case was the legal strategy. And the state of Oklahoma's legal team was using a very unique and unprecedented approach.
What we have here in Oklahoma in this opioid epidemic is a valid public nuisance.
The state's claim, which is what it's called in a civil court, was that Johnson & Johnson had created a public nuisance, meaning that it had created such a problem that it harmed the public and should be on the hook to rectify it.
In law school, I learned about public nuisance as if you build a dam on your property and it backs up water over the neighbor here, you have created a nuisance. So what does it cost to restore the neighbor's land? And the whole theory in this case was, what will it cost the state of Oklahoma to remedy this public nuisance if a nuisance exists?
Public nuisance had never been used in this way before for such a large, huge scope. Oklahoma law allows the Attorney General to go after as much money as necessary in order to abate the problem. So that was another reason why they chose public nuisance. They were asking for $17.5 billion, a huge amount of money, but they said that that was the cost in order to fix the opioid crisis in Oklahoma specifically. All of this money would have gone to Oklahoma. And bring it back to pre-opioid overdose and death levels.
After 7 weeks of testimony, both sides rested, and the decision to hold Johnson & Johnson culpable for the opioid crisis was left in the hands of one man, Judge Thad Balkman.
Come full circle, this entire summer has been bookended by this trial. I'm looking forward to the verdict today.
After 7 weeks of trial, I think that the judge will find for the state of Oklahoma. I will be very surprised if he does not.
As a lawyer, I literally have heard judges read hundreds of verdicts.
Thank you. Please have a seat.
Been a lawyer for 40 years. But this was special
Good afternoon.
because I knew Whichever way the judge went, it would signal for thousands of other cases in the country what might be done, whether they be settled, go to trial. It was a big, big deal.
The opioid crisis is an imminent danger and menace to Oklahomans.
So I had a few butterflies in my stomach, even though I was just sitting beside the judge holding a big stack of copies of the 42-page order to hand out to the media.
My judgment includes findings of fact and conclusions of law that the state met its burden, that the defendants, Janssen and Johnson & Johnson's misleading marketing and promotion of opioids created a nuisance as defined by 50 OS Section 1, including a finding that those actions compromised the health and safety of thousands of Oklahomans. Again, I thank you for the honor of presiding over this trial, and until we meet again, this court will be adjourned. Thank you.
Today, Judge Bachman has affirmed our position that Johnson & Johnson, motivated by greed and avarice, is responsible for the opioid epidemic in our state.
Am I optimistic? No, I'm not. I think they'll appeal this thing and fight till hell freezes over. But my boy and Austin are fighters, and we are too.
At the end of the day, it's about talent and resolve and courage. And this team had the talent and resolve and courage to take this case to trial and win. And so that's the message to other states.
I'd like to start out by saying we are disappointed and disagree with the judge's decision. We believe that it is flawed. We have sympathy for all who suffer from substance abuse. But Johnson & Johnson did not cause the opioid abuse crisis here in Oklahoma or anywhere in this country.
That day is really important to Oklahomans in general because it's the first time that a pharmaceutical company was found liable for their role in the opioid crisis. That's huge.
There's such a need in our state. We don't have enough addiction treatment. We don't have enough money to spend on prevention. But we needed help with that. We needed money from the people who helped drive it.
Oklahomans are already paying for the opioid crisis all the time. I mean, we pay for it every day, and people losing out on work, people not able to get treatment, people who end up, dying by suicide. There's a lot of different ways that the community is paying for the opioid crisis. And this verdict showed a lot of people that maybe someone was liable for it.
A trial of this magnitude has helped reduce the stigma. Because what it did, it allowed people to say, I was up against a monster. I was up against a monster, and the monster came and took my child away. But now we know the monster had a name, and it was Johnson & Johnson.